Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show, where we help you make the wisest and most profitable decisions. My name is Dr. Gleb Tsipursky. I'm the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts, the future of work consultancy that sponsors the Wise Decision Maker Show. And I'm joined today by Jenny. Jenny, can you please introduce yourself and share a little bit about what you do?
Sure. Well, thank you, first of all, for having me. My name is
Sure.
Jenny Shiers, and I'm Chief People Officer here at Unily.
Excellent. And I know that you, unlike many other organizations, are pursuing a more flexible model of work. So what do you see as the benefits of having this additional flexibility, and why do you think other companies are not pursuing it? Let's just take those step by step. What do you see as the benefits first?
I mean, there's a huge amount of benefit for us as a scaling organization. It really allows us to access and tap into some really, really good talent. I think there's a big chunk of folks out there who are really still searching for that true flexible model. And not all companies are offering that anymore. And so for us, it's a fantastic resource and attraction for new talent coming into the business. It's helping us drive a degree of equality and inclusion, definitely, because there's a whole bunch of people for whom the office-based 9 to 5 just doesn't work that well. And as a technology company, I think especially, there's a profile of deep work that has to happen sometimes, which actually just isn't that conducive to an office environment. So for us, it's been super successful. We're still using our offices, and that's great. And there's definitely a place for that, I think. But for us, the flex model is definitely around to stay.
So tell me a little bit more about what you're using the offices for. What is the purpose of the office for you?
I mean, the approach that we've taken is a team by team approach. I don't think either a blanket you work at home or a blanket you all come into the office is necessarily the way to do it. So, I mean, I think a lot of people talk about collaboration for the office. Also not sure that's always the right thing either, because people collaborate in different ways in the same way that they do deep work in different ways. But I think there's definitely a social aspect. I also think that for some roles and stages of career, what I would refer to as swivel chair learning is really important. And so just being around other people, listening into customer calls or how others go about their day-to-day can be really useful for the early stages of someone's career. And of course, where you're coming together for the first time, I think with teams, so maybe you're putting a new team together, I think definitely sometimes that kickoff of collaboration can be very useful in person.
So if you're hiring people are you hiring people who are not commuting distance from the office, or are all the people that you're hiring commuting distance from the office? And if you're hiring people, like you said, some remote people who are not commuting distance from the office, what do you do about them?
Yeah, so we actually have slightly different models depending on location. So in particular, our North America office, which is actually based in New York, which is, far up and far over to one side. But we have customers across the United States of America. And so actually we have quite a distributed workforce there. So we have a lot of people in the United States who'd be remote workers. They're contractually based from home. And then, yes, I mean, obviously we facilitate travel from time to time for things like a quarterly business review, or sometimes even for things like the holiday party. So we're providing that opportunity for people to get together. In the UK, we have 2 offices, and typically people would be located within commuting distance of one of those, but not everyone. And so for that, again, in that case, it's much more of a team by team or leader by leader decision as to what's appropriate and what's required. I think it's fair to say from an HR leader standpoint and from a finance standpoint, there is a cost implication, of course, of having people based remotely, but then you're paying for them to come into the office. And of course, you then have to also think about what's your utilization of your office space if you're going to keep an office space. So I don't think it's a clear-cut answer or decision for businesses to make, but I think if there's a way to try and find that balance, it's definitely the way forward for us as a company anyway.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like you have a number of people who are pretty much fully remote, who may be coming in for a holiday party or something like that, and some people who are hybrid, where the team leader decides what to do. So how do you manage to create a cohesive culture in that disaggregated environment?
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge. That's really the challenge, because I think what happened 4 years ago when we were in COVID was that companies at least had a culture, whatever the culture was, they had it. And so it was just like, it was a question of maintenance. And I think now the challenge that people teams and leadership teams are facing is, how do you actually go about creating that culture or keeping it alive in a distributed environment? And I think that's where technology can really play a part. And for me, it's something about the consistency of experience, so that it shouldn't feel like an us and them. It shouldn't feel like, oh, they're the remote people and here's the office people and here's the hybrid people. Broadly speaking, your experience with your employer and with the company that you work for should be consistent, whether you're home or not. And I think technology can really help us in that sense, in terms of how you're engaging, how you're communicating, how you're pulling people into the right content, the right training opportunities, all of that kind of good stuff that drives employee experience and employee engagement. I think without harnessing some of the technology that's out there to help do that, it becomes hit and miss, actually. So then it becomes much more about, well, what does your manager do? And what does your manager create your experience to be like day to day? And it's difficult for a single leader, a single people manager to kind of to drive that. You need to have the overview, the consistent approach.
Yeah, I find that, so I've helped about over 24 organizations figure out their hybrid work models, flexible work models, and to drive consistency, it takes a combination of technology and training. So technology and techniques. So what kind of techniques are you? So you talked about that swivel chair culture. So something I do with all my clients is help them integrate a technique called digital co-working, where everyone gets on a video conference call, whether it's Zoom, Microsoft Teams, whatever you're using, for an hour a day, 2 hours a day, and then they work on their individual tasks. And when they have a question, they can turn on their, so they work on their individual tasks, they turn off their microphones, they leave their speakers on, video optional. When they have a question, they can then turn on their microphone and ask that question. So that sort of emulates a little bit that swivel chair culture, where you have an ability to immediately turn to a colleague and ask a question. And that doesn't require technology that's different than stuff we had in the 2010s with Zoom, Skype, and Microsoft Teams, and so on. But it requires a different technique. How do you use that technology? So innovation in kind of technique use, because lots of managers are not trained on how to do this. So I find manager training and integrating this as policies to be really critical in effectively using technology to facilitate flexible work. What are you finding around manager training?
I think that's a great point. And for me, it actually in some ways is an evolution of the types of training we might have already been doing with managers around how do people learn? How do people like to receive feedback? How do people like to communicate? Fair to receive your guidance, because there's not a one size fits all for that either. And we would have been talking with that about with managers 5 or 10 years ago, and doing sort of profiling with them to show, well, look, everybody in your team's different. You've got some introverts, you've got some extroverts. People learn differently, they absorb information differently, they communicate differently. And I think this is an extension of that. And I think you're absolutely right that as we build manager training and enablement, especially if you're thinking about those who are stepping into a managerial position for the first time, you might already be covering content with them like, here's how to run a successful one-to-one, here's how to give difficult feedback. And I think it's just an extension to say, well, and here's how you can, provide that consistency to a hybrid team, or here's how you can engage your remote workers, or here's how you can leverage that swivel chair experience without having to be in the office. So I think it's an excellent point that you've made, that it's not going to come naturally to everyone.
Yeah.
And actually just thinking about it and setting out some expectations for managers as we do enablement for them in their roles is super important.
Now, it's okay, so that's helpful. So you're thinking about manager training and evolving it. I want to ask a question about a different aspect of the technology of generative AI. I've been working on that with clients, and we've definitely seen that generative AI makes remote work easier for a number of reasons. So I'm going to give a keynote at Microsoft's annual conference on how to use generative AI for innovation. That typically people are used to innovating in traditional brainstorming settings, but you can use generative AI hallucinates a lot, which is a problem for if you want to get the right answer. But innovation, you don't need to get the right answer.
Right.
You just need ideas. And we've definitely seen that generative AI gets high scores on, let's say, the Torrance test of creativity and other sorts of tests. So it's great at generating ideas, and you can use it to evaluate ideas by essentially asking it to take on different roles and from inside the company, from outside the company, like focus group surveys, using analytics. So generative AI can replace a lot of innovation that previously was done in person. It can also replace a lot of the swivel chair collaboration where you need to find out something from a colleague. But if you have generative AI trained on your internal company data, you can use the generative AI to replace people and the information they would have had. So I'm curious about your thoughts on how generative AI is going to impact the ability of people to work in a flexible manner, and what you're using, if you're using it in any way.
It's, it's an interesting point. I think you're right that it's just an alternative method of that sparking of ideas. And I think when we originally started talking about return to office for collaboration, that's real. People had this idea in their heads that people were sitting in a room or around a sofa, bouncing ideas off each other. And you're absolutely right that that's one of the things that we can use generative AI to do for us. And I think one of the nice things about using it in that way is, I think ideation, innovation, if you do it in person in an office environment, you work with the constraint that often the loudest voice in the room or the most senior person in the room or the most the person who fits the best tends to be the loudest and tends to get the most traction. That's a risk. It's, it's there. And actually replacing that and doing it in a different way and doing it remotely and maybe using AI to help with that process, I think is an interesting way to sort of take some of that bias out of the process.
Excellent. Now, as we finish up, what is your vision of what flexible work will look like in the future? We know that a number of companies are announcing return to office, and there's a lot of concern there by people who looks like they're going to your company and other companies that are offering more flexibility. So what do you see as the future of flexible work going forward in the next couple of years?
I think we're on a bit of a roller coaster. So I think we'll see peaks and troughs of it. I think the risk is for companies that are really mandating heavily that there'll be a backlash. So I think I would tread carefully with that. Although I think some of the concerns that some organizations are trying to tackle are understandable and they're real. I think, therefore, the things that people leaders and thought leaders can be, really working on and thinking deeply about is, I think the training point is a great idea. I think just being clearer with people. I think feedback is super important. One of the things I see as an HR leader is there's a concern, actually sometimes this concern around where is someone, what are they doing, isn't really about where they are, because someone is a top performer. You don't care where they are if they're doing great work. It's actually a concern about, I'm not sure if this is the right person for my role. I'm not sure. Therefore, providing better, more transparent feedback and having better career conversations with people, I think will make a difference. I'm not an advocate of either fully remote or fully back to office. I think the ability to provide workers with what suits them is, we're all human beings and we're all different. And I think the ability to do that, if it works for your business model, is very powerful to get the best from people. And I think I expect that's where many companies will land, that there won't be a one size fits all, because when was that ever the right thing? And we've all got to remember that 4 or 5 years ago and beyond, when it was an expectation that everybody was in the office, you were battling much harder with issues of equality and access. And so we've made strides, and I think we just have to find our middle ground so that we can get comfortable again with the new normal.
I think that's a nice message to leave it. Thank you very much, Jenny. That was very helpful. Really appreciate you sharing your expertise.
Thank you for having me. It was lovely to chat.
And thank you to the audience for checking out another episode of the Wise Decision Maker Show. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you checked out the show and leave a review. It helps others discover the show, and it helps us improve the show.